On the 10th of August 2019, one of the most infamous prisoners in America was found dead inside a jail cell in New York City. His name was Jeffrey Epstein, a wealthy financier with extraordinary connections. He had spent years moving through the same circles as presidents, billionaires, celebrities, and even royalty. Just weeks earlier, federal agents had arrested him on explosive sex trafficking charges involving underage girls. Prosecutors alleged they had uncovered a network that had operated for years behind the walls of his luxurious properties. If convicted, Epstein faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. But before any trial could begin, everything changed. In the early hours of that August morning, Jeffrey Epstein was dead. Authorities ruled it a suicide. Yet, almost immediately, doubts began to spread. Why were critical surveillance cameras reportedly not capturing usable footage? Why were jail procedures allegedly not followed that night? And how could one of the highest profile inmates in the country die while under federal custody? The question sparked global headlines, endless speculation, and countless investigations. But perhaps the biggest mystery wasn't how Jeffrey Epstein died, it was how he lived. Who exactly was Jeffrey Epstein? How did a man with no clear public business empire accumulate enormous wealth, build relationships with some of the most powerful people on earth, and become the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern history? Jeffrey Epstein was born in 1953 and raised in a working-class neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. He wasn't the son of a wealthy businessman, a politician, or a member of America's elite. In fact, nothing about his early life suggested he would one day move among some of the most powerful people in the world. As a student, Epstein was known for being intelligent, particularly in mathematics. He attended college for a short time, but never earned a degree. Unlike many successful financiers, he had no Ivy League education, no prestigious credentials, and no obvious path to extraordinary wealth. Then, an unexpected opportunity changed everything. In the mid-1970s, Epstein was hired as a teacher at Manhattan's prestigious Dalton School, an institution attended by the children of New York's wealthiest families. For the first time, he found himself surrounded by people connected to major corporations, investment firms, and influential social circles. What seemed like a simple teaching job became something much bigger. It was Jeffrey Epstein's first step into a world of money, power, and privilege, a world that would ultimately define the rest of his life. After his time at the Dalton School, Jeffrey Epstein made a move that seemed even more surprising. Despite having no college degree, he managed to enter one of the most competitive industries in America, high finance. In the late 1970s, he joined the investment bank Bear Stearns and quickly built a reputation as someone who could navigate the world of wealthy clients. His rise appeared unusually rapid, and within a few years, he was moving among people with far greater experience and credentials. Then, just as his career seemed to be taking off, Epstein left the firm under circumstances that have remained the subject of speculation for decades. What happened next was even more mysterious. Over the following years, Epstein began presenting himself as a financial advisor and wealth manager to extremely rich clients. Yet very little was publicly known about his business. He rarely discussed who his clients were. His companies operated with remarkable secrecy. There were few details about how his investments worked or exactly where his income originated. Nevertheless, his fortune appeared to grow at an extraordinary pace. He acquired luxurious mansions in New York, Palm Beach, Paris, and New Mexico. He owned private aircraft and eventually purchased a private island in the Caribbean. To outsiders, it looked like a spectacular success story. But behind the wealth was a question that followed Jeffrey Epstein for years. How had a former schoolteacher with no degree accumulated such enormous wealth while revealing so little about how he earned it? As Jeffrey Epstein's fortune grew, so did the list of powerful people who appeared in his orbit. By the 1990s and early 2000s, he was no longer just a mysterious financier with enormous wealth. He had become a man who seemed to have access to almost everyone. Former President Bill Clinton was linked to multiple flights on Epstein's private jet, Donald Trump, years before becoming president, was photographed with him at social events in Florida and New York. Britain's Prince Andrew was also known to have spent time with Epstein and would later become one of the most controversial figures connected to the case. The list did not stop there. Prominent businessmen, academics, scientists, celebrities, and influential public figures were all reportedly part of Epstein's unusually expansive social network. To many observers, it was difficult to understand how one man had managed to build relationships across so many different worlds. Then there was the private jet. Over the years, flight logs revealed frequent trips involving wealthy and well-connected passengers. The aircraft eventually received a nickname from the media, the Lolita Express. Many of those flights traveled to Epstein's private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a secluded property that would later become central to countless allegations and investigations. At the time, however, most people knew very little about what happened there. Rumors circulated, stories appeared in tabloids and gossip columns, but concrete evidence remained scarce, and few outsiders could see behind the walls of Epstein's private world. Still, a pattern was beginning to emerge. The wealth, the secrecy, the powerful connections. Individually, none of these details proved wrongdoing. But together, they formed the first clue that Jeffrey Epstein's story might be far more complicated and far darker than anyone realized. In March 2005, a phone call to police in Palm Beach, Florida, changed everything. A concerned mother reported that her 14-year-old daughter had been approached with what sounded like an easy way to earn money. According to the teenager, she had been invited to the home of a wealthy man and paid to provide a massage. At first glance, it might have seemed unusual, but not necessarily criminal. Then, the girl described what allegedly happened next. According to her account, the encounter became sexual. The man she identified was Jeffrey Epstein. Investigators began looking into the allegation, expecting what could have been an isolated incident. Instead, they discovered something far more troubling. As detectives interviewed witnesses and followed leads, additional young women began coming forward. Then, more names appeared, and then more. What caught investigators' attention was not only the growing number of allegations, but also how similar many of the stories sounded. Several accusers described being recruited by another young woman who had already met Epstein. Many said they were promised money for a massage. Some alleged that the situation gradually became sexual. Others claimed they were encouraged to bring friends, creating a chain that expanded with each new participant. The details varied from person to person, but investigators believed a pattern was beginning to emerge. What initially appeared to be a single complaint was rapidly developing into a much larger investigation. For years, Epstein had been known as a wealthy financier with powerful friends and extraordinary connections. Now, detectives were asking a very different question. Was this simply a series of unrelated accusations, or had they uncovered the early signs of a carefully organized system operating behind the walls of Jeffrey Epstein's luxurious properties? For the first time, the spotlight was no longer on Epstein's wealth. It was on the people accusing him. By 2007, the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein had grown far beyond a single complaint. Detectives had gathered statements from numerous young women, federal prosecutors were reviewing the evidence. The allegations were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as isolated incidents. For many observers, it seemed only a matter of time before Epstein faced serious federal charges. After all, the accusations were mounting, the investigation was expanding, and public attention was beginning to grow. It looked as though one of the most connected men in America was finally about to face the full weight of the justice system. Then, everything changed. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial plea agreement with federal prosecutors. Instead of facing the possibility of severe federal penalties, he pleaded guilty to lesser state charges involving solicitation-related offenses. The deal effectively shielded him from a broader federal prosecution at that time and limited the legal consequences he faced. The outcome shocked many people. Epstein was sentenced to jail, but the conditions quickly became the focus of criticism. During much of his sentence, he was permitted to leave the facility for extended periods under a work release arrangement before returning later in the day. Even more controversial was the revelation that several victims later said they had not been properly informed about the agreement before it was finalized. To critics, the message seemed impossible to ignore. An ordinary defendant facing similar allegations might have received a vastly different outcome. Yet, Jeffrey Epstein appeared to have negotiated one of the most favorable deals imaginable. For a moment, it felt as if the story was over, the investigation had ended, the case was closed, and the man at the center of the allegations had escaped with far less punishment than many expected. But what nobody realized at the time was that this agreement would not bury the scandal. Instead, it would become one of the biggest reasons the case refused to disappear. The real reckoning was still years away. As investigators continued interviewing victims and reviewing evidence, a second name began appearing again and again. Not a politician, not a billionaire businessman, but a woman who had spent years at Jeffrey Epstein's side. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. For a long time, Maxwell had been viewed publicly as Epstein's close companion and trusted associate. She moved comfortably within elite social circles and appeared alongside powerful figures from both sides of the Atlantic. But according to numerous allegations, her role extended far beyond friendship. Several accusers claimed Maxwell was often the first person they met. They described a woman who appeared sophisticated, friendly, and approachable, someone capable of making young girls feel comfortable and safe. According to testimony later presented in court proceedings, Maxwell allegedly helped identify potential victims, establish trust, and introduce them to Epstein's world. Some accusers claimed she normalized inappropriate behavior and encouraged them to view Epstein as a generous benefactor rather than a dangerous predator. As more accounts surfaced, investigators began seeing a pattern. The allegations suggested an operation that was far more organized than many had originally imagined. This no longer looked like the actions of a wealthy man acting entirely alone. Instead, evidence and testimony increasingly pointed toward a system that allegedly relied on recruitment, introductions, and a steady flow of young girls brought into Epstein's orbit over many years. The implications were enormous. If the allegations were true, then the story was no longer simply about Jeffrey Epstein. It was about a network, a structure that allegedly operated across multiple properties, involved numerous individuals, and remained hidden in plain sight for decades. For years, Epstein had been portrayed as the central figure in the scandal. Now, investigators were beginning to ask a different question. How many people knew what was happening, and how many may have helped keep the system running? The deeper authorities looked, the larger and more disturbing the picture appeared to become. For years, it seemed as though Jeffrey Epstein had escaped the consequences that many believed were inevitable. The 2008 plea agreement had largely removed him from the spotlight. While criticism never completely disappeared, the criminal case that once threatened his future appeared to be over. But behind the scenes, the story was far from finished. Journalists continued digging, victims continued speaking, and new information kept emerging. One of the most significant turning points came from investigative reporting that re-examined the controversial plea deal and revealed details that many members of the public had never fully understood. The renewed attention brought fresh scrutiny to Epstein's past and raised difficult questions about how the earlier case had been handled. At the same time, more women came forward with allegations. Some described experiences that closely resembled accounts investigators had heard years earlier. Others claimed they had remained silent out of fear, embarrassment, or the belief that nobody would listen. The growing number of accusations created momentum that authorities could no longer ignore. Public pressure intensified. Media coverage expanded. The story that once seemed buried was suddenly back in the national spotlight. Then came the moment that changed everything. In July 2019, federal agents arrested Jeffrey Epstein at an airport in New Jersey. The charges were far more serious than those involved in his earlier plea agreement. Federal prosecutors accused him of operating a sex trafficking scheme involving underage girls over a period of years. This time, the stakes were dramatically different. There was no indication that another unusually favorable deal was waiting. No obvious escape route. No guarantee that his wealth, connections, or influence could protect him. If convicted on the federal charges, Epstein faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. For the first time in more than a decade, many victims believed justice might finally be within reach. The man who had seemed untouchable was now sitting in a federal jail cell, and it appeared that the full story was finally about to be told in court. But before the trial could begin, another shocking twist would change the case forever. Just 1 month after his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was dead. For years, critics had argued that he had avoided accountability. Now, for the first time, he was facing serious federal charges that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. Many believed the upcoming trial would finally expose the full scope of the allegations against him. It never happened. On the morning of the 10th of August 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive inside his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. Despite emergency efforts, he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The official ruling was suicide by hanging. Legally, that should have answered the question. Instead, it created dozens of new ones. Almost immediately, reports emerged describing a series of troubling failures inside the jail. Some surveillance cameras near the area were reportedly malfunctioning or failed to capture footage investigators expected to review. 2 correctional officers assigned to monitor the housing unit were later accused of not performing required inmate checks and allegedly falsifying records to suggest the inspections had taken place. Questions were also raised about supervision procedures. Just weeks earlier, Epstein had reportedly been placed under enhanced observation after a previous incident inside the facility. Yet by the time of his death, those restrictions had been lifted. To many people, the circumstances seemed difficult to ignore. How could one of the most high-profile prisoners in America die while awaiting trial under such conditions? The unanswered questions fueled a wave of speculation unlike anything seen in recent criminal history. Conspiracy theories exploded across television, social media, podcasts, and news outlets around the world. Some believed powerful figures wanted Epstein silenced before he could testify. Others accepted the official findings, but questioned how so many security failures could occur at the same time. More than 5 years later, the official conclusion remains unchanged. Yet for millions of people, the mystery surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's death remains one of the most controversial and debated chapters of the entire case. Jeffrey Epstein was dead. The man at the center of one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern American history would never stand trial. Many victims would never have the opportunity to confront him in court, and many questions that prosecutors hoped to answer would remain unresolved. Yet the investigation did not end with Epstein's death. Attention quickly shifted to those who had been part of his inner circle, most notably Ghislaine Maxwell. Federal prosecutors alleged that Maxwell had played a key role in recruiting and grooming underage girls for Epstein over a period of years. After a highly publicized trial, she was convicted on multiple federal charges in 2021 and later sentenced to prison. At the same time, courts began releasing thousands of pages of documents connected to the Epstein investigation and related civil lawsuits. The records generated enormous public interest because they contained references to politicians, celebrities, business leaders, academics, and other well-known figures. News organizations around the world analyzed the documents line by line. However, investigators and legal experts repeatedly emphasized an important point. A person's name appearing in court records, flight logs, contact books, or witness testimony does not automatically mean that person committed a crime or was involved in criminal activity. Even with years of investigations, lawsuits, arrests, and document releases, many uncertainties remain. How extensive was Epstein's network? How many victims have never come forward? Who knew what was happening? And how much of the full story may never be known? Those questions continue to fuel public fascination with the case long after Jeffrey Epstein's death, ensuring that the search for answers remains far from over. As this story comes to an end, one reality remains impossible to ignore. Jeffrey Epstein is gone. He will never sit in a courtroom and answer the countless questions that still surround his life, his connections, and the network investigators spent years trying to understand. Yet the story did not end with his death. The victims are still here. The court records still exist. The unanswered questions remain. Some pieces of the truth have been uncovered through investigations, lawsuits, witness testimony, and years of reporting. But many people believe there are still gaps in the story, details that may never be fully explained. Perhaps some answers were lost forever on the night Epstein died inside his jail cell. And maybe that uncertainty is exactly why this case continues to fascinate people around the world years later. Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are not the ones we can solve. They are the ones that leave us wondering what we may never know. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Jeffrey Epstein case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective and discuss it with you. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you won't miss future true crime stories. Thank you very much for watching until the end. I truly appreciate your support. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next story.